names like American Airlines sort of feel very old school, Bank of America type names. These are names that feel they feel like the establishment. They feel very much sort of almost what movements are being set up to oppose. And they're just very descriptive. They describe a physical place or a physical thing, or they describe what a company does. We provide banking services. We fly planes from America. A movement brand isn't necessarily about what a brand does, the physical products that it makes or the physical services that it provides. A movement brand is much more about what the brand stands for, and what the brand believes in, and the change or impact on the world that the brand is trying to achieve.
Welcome to Uprising. Each episode looks inside what it takes to lead the most dynamic and successful cultural movements. Some of them in the business world, some in the social realm, some in politics, and some in between. To see why people start uprisings, what gives those initiatives momentum and keeps them going, and most important, what lessons can you learn from these movements and how to apply them to your business and even personal life. Let's explore the secret to sparking movements that move people into action.
Passionate ideas.
Controversial ideas.
Uprising ideas.
The power is now in the hands of anyone.
To start a cultural movement.
Your movement.
To
move the world.
Today's Uprising Pod is brought to you by warbyparker.com. Get a free 5-day home try-on at www.warbyparkertrial.com/uprising. 5 pairs, 5 days, 100% free.
Hello, I'm Scott Goodson in New York City overlooking the beautiful Madison Square Park, and you're listening to the Uprising Pod. Names like Uber, CRISPR, Orange, Bluetooth sound like names at the front of a movement. Bluetooth, the technology name developed by Ericsson of Sweden together with HP, was named for the famous Bluetooth Scandinavian Viking. There's the smart car, the B-segment two-seater that I helped launch, that was at the forefront of the movement to reinvent the urban environment with the motto, reduce to the max. There are brand names like Google, Blue Apron, Fresh Direct, and Bonobos, and many others. So today on the Uprising Pod, the question we want to ask is there such a thing as an awesome brand name at the front of a movement? Or are there really, really bad ones? And joining me today is Martyn Tipping, one of the world's foremost naming professionals. Welcome to our show, Martyn.
Thanks a lot, Scott.
So you're in the hot seat, and we have some major questions for you, but basically we like to talk about naming. And so with this in mind, are there names, in your opinion, that perform better for brands or organizations that want to lead a marketing movement?
When it comes to naming, the best names are those names that tell a story. And so when you have a name that allows you to tell that story, when that story is connected to the movement. So, for example, the Honest Company, the name itself gives you permission to tell the story of that company's focus and its mission to sort of produce toxin-free and very simple, pure products. So when you're out there starting a new brand from scratch, having a name that sort of aligns with that story or gives you permission to tell that story is very important. It's not about communicating and telling the whole story in the name, because that story is going to change and it's going to evolve over time. And, stories tend to be a lot harder or a lot longer than you are able to convey in sort of 8 letters or less. But having a name that allows you to tell that story is, I think, important. But I don't think there's such a thing necessarily as a good movement name or a bad movement name. I mean, names obviously that have a call to action in them make really strong movement names. Something like We Work, for example, there's an active, almost call to action in the name itself. But, you can look at names like Tom's, or you look at, even brand names like Dove that have really built strong movements around their brand. They've done so almost in spite of their name and what their mean names. There's nothing inherent in the word Tom's. It could have been Dick's, or could have been maybe not Dick's, but could have been Harry's, for example. And it wouldn't have been, they would have still been able to do what they've achieved under the Tom's name. It's nothing about Tom's that enables them to sort of build that movement around their name.
So why couldn't you call it Dick's Shoes?
I think you could call it Dick's Shoes. I was possibly being flippant. Part of being a movement or having a strong movement is that people want to identify with the brand. And you might wear a button saying I'm a dick, but might not.
Okay, so obviously you are from the UK, you moved to New York City from there. How do modern disruptive brand names differ here in the United States versus, your experience in the UK or in Europe?
I think in the UK, and I think what you're starting to see here is there tends to be brands are thinking not just about the names and the brand name itself, but they're thinking about the whole role of language in the brand. And if you think about it, we're living in an age where brands are creating more verbiage. They're using more words than they've ever had to use in the past. If you're on social media and you're writing posts, you're creating probably as much language in the space of sort of a month as would have gone into an annual report in the past, but you're doing this month after month after month. So thinking about things like tone of voice and the way you use language is very important. I would say some of the earlier brands that did a really good job of this at sort of capturing unique tones of voice and being really distinctive with their language. Some of those brands that we sort of used as role models sort of came out of the UK. One in particular I'm thinking about is sort of Innocent Drinks, where
that's a great brand.
Yeah, the language that they have on the back of their, the back of their packaging. You would buy one of their bottles, and it's no exaggeration. You could have as much fun with reading the package and looking at sort of what they'd written, even in sort of small places. So the copyright symbol, that C sort of copyright symbol, they would just put the word cow-free next to it, as in there's no cows in this product. You don't know what copyright is, but it's these little moments of delight that you can achieve with words that I think started, or I saw it earlier, or was more aware of it earlier when I was back visiting the UK. But that's definitely crossing over here. And you do start to see that now. Brands are starting to place a lot more emphasis on words.
I worked in Europe for many years, and I remember back in the 1990s and even 2000s, there were so many great names that were coming out of the UK. There was a bank brand that was launched by Prudential called Egg, as in scrambled eggs. It was such an innovative and unconventional name. Even I remember when Orange launched, against British Telecom and other competitors, it just felt like such a, I don't know, like a fresh, it just encapsulated, environmentalism, fragrant, there was a fragrance to it, it was a fresh feeling, and just the complete, just a disruptive name in the telecoms business. And I just thought that was such a, I don't know, very much of a UK culture. They were just incredibly innovative and fresh with the way they think about naming. I came across one the other day, which is this wonderful cosmetic brand in the UK called Ordinary. Have you heard about that one? Ordinary?
Haven't heard of that one. It's a great name.
Cool. Great name, yeah. But these are brands that just feel like they're, I don't know, you can get behind them, right? They feel like they're value based. They have an idea, as you say. There's a backstory, but to me, a brand like Orange feels like a movement more than like British Telecom, or the Body Shop felt. I mean, it was a movement for a long time, the Body Shop, but it felt like a brand movement versus Clarins. I don't know. Naming business, obviously, since you started, has changed so much. Can you describe, it today versus when you started?
I think that that emphasis on not just the name, but on the whole brand language is something that's becoming more important. So, as I say, being able to being able to have create content, create manifestos, create points of view. A brand like Lululemon, or even you look at what a brand like Old Spice did, where they essentially reinvented that entire brand almost exclusively through the tone of voice. Sure, they had the great ad, I'm on a horse, but it's the words of that were just so strange and compelling, and sort of they made you think in a whole new way about the brand. So I started to see, like I say, brands paying a lot more attention to words. I think another thing that's happened is, frankly, companies are creating far fewer new brands than they were 20 years ago. They're relying primarily on, certainly the big companies are relying on brand extensions. And brand extensions tend to have more descriptive or simpler, straightforward names because they rely on the parent brand. So where you see a lot of the excitement and a lot of the innovation happening on the naming front tends to be at the smaller sort of startup end of the spectrum, which wasn't always the way it used to be. In fact, it used to be kind of the opposite, that the startups would just give very straightforward, uninspiring names until they got big enough to have to worry about changing their name. Whereas now, if you want to stand out, you sort of have to have a distinctive name as a startup, and it's the big guys who are really, we're seeing quite a lack of innovation in naming. I think the other thing that we start to see is, again, 20 years ago, I worked on the naming of Altria and Accenture and Verizon, and all of these coined names, where part of the reason that you ended up with a coined name like that was because big companies were very, very concerned about trademark law, and they wanted to have something as distinctive and protectable and ownable as possible. And you compare that with something like Google changing the name of the holding company to Alphabet. Well, I guarantee there's a legal department that will be being kept busy with legal conflicts over the name Alphabet for many, many years to come. But I guess for the sake of having a good name, certain big companies are willing to sort of sacrifice some of the distinctiveness and some of the uniqueness of a name, and just say, look, we're Google. It's big enough that people will know we're Alphabet in time, and if there's any problems along the way, we'll take care of it.
So do you think that today it's harder to come up with a name and register it compared to like 10 years ago or 20 years ago when you were starting up?
I mean, it's coming up with names has always been easy, and we always used to say, everybody can come up with kind of good names. The challenge is coming up with a good name that nobody else has come up with in your class. It's like if you had
must be really difficult. I mean, there must be so many names that you come up with, oh, that's a brilliant name, and then you check and go, oh, geez, it's taken.
Yeah, it's like 80 to 90% of what we come up with in creative sort of ends up failing a preliminary legal screening or failing sort of full legal searches. And even if it clears full legal searches, you then find out that it means something offensive in Brazil or another key market, of the company that's selling the product. So, you've got a lot of criteria. The linguistic criteria, companies as they get global are sort of more concerned about those things. It used to be that if your product meant something offensive in Romania or China, you wouldn't necessarily find out about it, and it certainly wouldn't go, it certainly wouldn't be sort of on the internet as a viral meme within 48 hours. But now that's now that's not the case. You have to be much more sensitive for the linguistic side of things. But again, I think what you start to see is that companies are willing to, they're willing to say, look, we don't need to own this name in every single trademark class or in every single category. We just need to own it for the specific goods and services we're offering, and then we'll build a brand behind it over time. So it's in some ways it's become harder. In other ways, as people sort of become a bit more realistic about what their name is going to be used for, some ways it's become easier. And then, of course, you have the whole domain name thing, which now I think people are more used to accepting workarounds if a URL is not available, and even if a URL is available and has been registered, going back 15 years, people would want to charge $100,000 to sell a URL they were squatting on, and now those prices have become much more reasonable as well. So,
for you, the listeners of Scott Goodson's Uprising Pod, Warby Parker is offering a free 5-day home try-on to give you the opportunity to check out their glasses. To get your home try-on today, go to warbyparkertrial.com/uprising. Again, that's warbyparkertrial.com/uprising for your free 5-day home try-on.
Let's say someone came to you and, asked for you to develop a cultural movement brand versus, let's say, a traditional brand. What advice would you have for them from the beginning if you were to say, okay, here's what you need to do in order for me to come up with this? How would you, how would you work with them? What advice would you give them?
So I think it's really important to understand how the name is going to be used. And where it's going to be used, and having a name that, potentially, like Google could perhaps be used as a verb, or perhaps could be used as sounds like a call to action or a rallying cry, is really important. I think the trend now, particularly for movement brands, is you have to have authenticity in your name. So I think brands, again, typically are trying to move away from the Altria or Accenture or, Latin-based, Greek-based names. And they want a name that just sounds real, because that's what we connect to, something we recognize, something that, if it was written on a placard or put on a T-shirt, people would understand what it is you sort of stand for.
So, in your opinion, what's the difference between, say, a name like American Airlines compared to Virgin or Tinder or Airbnb?
You look at something like Virgin Atlantic, that was all about disrupting the whole sort of British Airways, American Airlines model of, no entertainment, lousy food, uncomfortable seats, and transforming the experience. And Virgin had that very sort of fresh, irreverent attitude that's inherent in that name. I mean, it takes sort of a bold attitude to sort of label yourself Virgin. It's quite exciting to sort of say, Virgin, we're new to this category and we're going to shake this category up. And they've done that with every category they've gone into. That's been their attitude. They've gone into mobile or banking or fitness or trains. They've gone into these sort of typically very monopolistic, old school kind of industries. And they have that sort of attitude of shaking things up.
Is that the same thing as Trump, in the way that they've gone into different industries?
I'm not sure that Richard Branson would appreciate the comparison. And Virgin's not been. I mean, I think Virgin may be have a higher batting average in the industries they've gone into than Trump. But it's a similar. I mean, it's a similar model in that you have a brand that allows you to. That because of its perceptions allows you to enter into different categories. I would argue that Virgin has more substance to it than Trump does, because the Trump promise is essentially one that, and again, I think when brands that promise you sort of wealth and power and a successful lifestyle, when you start applying those to things like clothing in Macy's, steaks, water, vodka, all of those kinds of areas, there's very little connection between the promise and the delivery and the experience. And so I think ultimately those brands are always going to disappoint.
Right.
Whereas I think what Virgin's promising is not something as intangible. They're not promising you a lifestyle. They're not promising you something that's aspirational. They're promising you something that they're actually able to deliver on, and you appreciate that difference and you feel that delivery from the moment you sort of first encounter that brand. So when you first stepped onto a Virgin plane, or even from the minute before you stepped onto the plane, when you went into check-in or when you went to the website, you knew you were dealing with something different, and they were able to start delivering on that promise. And at every touch point, every little thing they did reinforced that sense that you were part of something bigger, that you were part of a movement. And I would argue that with Trump steaks and water and ties and all of that thing, they're not reinforcing sort of success and power with every touch point. It's not like you feel more powerful and successful when you walk into Macy's and buy a Trump, or used to be able to walk into Macy's and buy a Trump tie. It didn't make you feel powerful and successful. In many ways, it was sort of almost the promise sort of, the brand never lived up to that promise. And that's a fatal mistake for any brand, particularly a movement brand. You have to be authentic. You have to deliver on what it is you're promising.
I really much appreciate you spending time with me today on the Uprising podcast. Martyn Tipping runs one of the most successful naming companies in the United States, based in New York City. He joins me today, Scott Goodson, here on the Uprising podcast. And one final question. So as someone who creates names, for huge companies, and what are some of the big movements that you see in the current environment out there, and how are they influencing the way you think about brand names as you develop them for your clients?
It's an interesting time for brands and branding, and I think a lot of brands are trying to figure out how they play and sort of exist in this sort of crazy new world that we seem to be living in 2017. And lots of brands are trying to figure out, should they take a stand, should they not take a stand? If they do take a stand, on which side of the fence they are going to be. And I think we're going to see consumers looking at brands to be more accountable for the decisions that they make and the way they behave. And I think you're going to start to see successful brands are going to figure out a way to do that, well. And some brands will be rewarded for it, and some brands will be punished for it. But I don't know that for a lot of brands, staying on the fence won't be an option. For some it will, but for a lot of brands, the ones that we feel most emotionally connected to, brands are kind of like badges or buttons. And literally sort of with fashion, you have your Ralph Lauren polo or your Adidas stripes or whatever it is. It's literally a badge on your apparel. And I think that for a lot of people, they wear their brands with pride, so they want to know what these brands stand for. And brands that are able to stand for something more than just I paid a higher price for this, will be successful. I think storytelling continues to be a huge movement as well with branding, and we continue to see brands that tell stories, or brands leveraging stories to get people emotionally connected. And that's why I say I think the types of stories that brands tell and the way they use these stories to build connections is going to be really critical to sort of fostering that sense of movement.
Martyn, this has been very interesting, and I very much appreciate your time. If anybody wanted to find you, do you have a Twitter handle or a Instagram handle or something like that? What's your name on the social space?
So you can find us on Twitter at MEHTIP, and website is tippinggardner.com.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, and much appreciated.
Thanks a lot, Scott.
Thank you for joining our Uprising today and listening to our show. If you missed the show, or if you want to find out more about who was on, Or if you want to learn more about how to create your own uprising, please go to uprisingmovements.com. You can also download this Uprising program from iTunes. Uprising was produced by Nicola Keneally and Adam Helen, with special help from Melanie Boardman, Karin Drachenberg, Philippa Freeman, Brianna Campbell, Fashad Faroudi, Mark Bruzy, Will Issam, James Politi, and Jonathan Weeks. My name is Scott Goodson, and you've been listening to Uprising. What we can learn about movements and uprisings that are shaping our world in business, in society, and in between. For more on cultural movements and movement marketing, be sure to pick up a copy of the best-selling book Uprising, How to Build a Brand and Change the World by Sparking Cultural Movements, available on Amazon.com.
Music for Uprising composed by Charles Duchateau.